Welcome back to MMA Al Dente. I'm here to talk about Dan Argueta versus Miles Johns. Oh yeah, I'm the guy who picked Frank Trigg to defeat Carlos Condit. All right. I'm here to talk about Miles Johns and Dan Argueta. Johns is 29 years old, 13-2 as a pro, and he's given up 2 inches of reach to 30-year-old Argueta, who is 9-1 as a pro. Argueta lost that one fight to Damon Jackson in his UFC debut. It's a forgivable loss, but even more forgivable with context. He moved up in weight and on short notice, and he had Damon Jackson all over him, backpacking him, and he kept himself safe, out of danger for the whole fight, which is a victory in itself, but also taking the fight on short notice and not falling apart down the stretch showed something about his cardio. And he had his moments in that fight too. But his next fight, he beat Nick Aguirre in the UFC. That's his only UFC victory. And in that fight, his cardio was on full display. He had his back taken in round 1, but then took Nick Aguirre's back in round 2 and actually had more success with it. And then took over the fight. And then against Ronnie Lawrence, he was denied a victory, in my opinion. He was going to get a guillotine choke, but whatever, it didn't happen. I mean, he had the guillotine very tight for a very long time, which you could say bodes well for Ronnie Lawrence getting out of it. But I still think it was really tight, and even before that, Dan Argueta looked phenomenal in those 2 minutes or whatever. So, victory or not, or however you consider it, I'm sure your estimation of him as a fighter went up with that performance. He's a guy who's been 5 rounds before, beat Diego Silva. I think that was the LFA. It's a split decision, but he won the fight, definitely. He got a 3rd round TKO. That was in the LFA over Myron Santos before he came to the UFC. He does have one other loss as an exhibition fight. It's to Ricky Turcios on The Ultimate Fighter. 2-round decision. I think that was 2 rounds. But either way, it was a close enough fight. He was just out-hustled in the end and out-positioned. Ricky Turcios, despite having some mixed results in the UFC, he's a phenomenal fighter, and he ended up winning that show anyway. But Dan Argueta's got a lot of hustle in him, and he seems like a really tough guy. Watching him survive with Damon Jackson, that's enough to take away the stain of his amateur loss that he actually did get tapped as an amateur. But yeah, just my estimation of him as a fighter is that he's going to be really, really tough to put away and really tough to out-hustle on the feet or on the ground. Miles Johns, 13-2 record. He has 6 finishes in his 13 wins, 4 by TKO or knockout, 2 by submission, and 7 by decision. He's a guy that, as I mentioned in my last few videos about him probably, he's a guy that his wrestling is slowing down a little bit, but he can do everything. It's just he's not a reliable wrestler so much these days. And I look to his losses and say in the John Castaneda fight, he was out-hustled, and I can see Dan Argueta actually duplicating a lot of the success Castaneda had in that fight. That ended with a 3rd round arm triangle choke, a technical choke. He wasn't tapping, but he was choked out in round 3. Castaneda was all over him, and his other loss is also a finish. Mario Batista knocked him out with a flying knee. And Batista's very dangerous, not the most powerful guy, but a very dangerous guy, and nothing more powerful than a flying knee. Johns has good power himself, though, and he carries it deep into the fight. He's got 2 third-round finishes, knockouts, over Kevin Natividad and Anderson Dos Santos. And we've seen him hustle, too, his decision over Cole Smith. He took over later in the fight. And also, before he got to the UFC, he had a 5-round decision victory over Adrian Yanez. But really, in this one here, I think I'm siding with Dan Argueta. Miles Johns, I know he can take away a lot of Dan Argueta's strengths and neutralize the wrestler and win the fight on the feet. But I think even on the feet, it's a matter of power versus volume. I expect Argueta to rack up more points and Johns to have to hurt him to rack up points. And it's not that Miles Johns is somebody winging power shots. He's much more of a volume guy than some Josh Koscheck type or whatever. I don't know their fucking numbers, to be honest. Maybe Koscheck had more volume, but I'm saying Miles Johns is a guy that he's not just relying on power shots, but I expect Dan Argueta to still rack up more numbers in general. He's just a hustler, and I expect Dan Argueta to have a sharper round 3. I think Miles Johns is in the realm of winning this fight. It's not like I love Dan Argueta, but I like Dan Argueta to win the fight. And I know Miles Johns beat Levi Moles, who is a really good wrestler, and he was able to shut him down earlier in his career. So, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me, but I'm going with Dan Argueta. Dan Argueta by decision is the pick. I think, in a striking battle, I'd still slightly favor Argueta. And with the wrestling, unless one just totally shuts down the other and just that much better, I expect Dan Argueta to take over in that department too down the stretch. I just like his hustle, and I trust his durability as well. As for somebody getting the finish, Johns is more powerful on the feet, but he's also the only guy who's been knocked out. And even though Argueta was tapped as an amateur, I like that he survived with Damon Jackson all over him. I trust him not to get tapped before I do Miles Johns. So I think the first finish would go to Dan Argueta, and the decision, I'm picking Argueta as well. So I played Dan Argueta's money line, minus 175, and Miles Johns, I threw a sprinkle on his decision at plus 275. Because, again, I think if he wins, that is definitely his path to victory, whereas Dan Argueta's got a few more options. So we'll see what happens, but I'm going with Argueta. Like, share, subscribe, all that horse shit. Check out my other videos.